Hey everyone, welcome into our latest Cannabis in 5. I'm your host, Shad Dales. Today's podcast is presented by Dutchie, your all-in-one source for point-of-sale, e-commerce. If you operate a dispensary and looking for better efficiency, make sure to visit business.dutchie.com. So as we head into today's episode, we're going to unpack a story that at first glance doesn't seem to belong in our lane, but that could change how Washington thinks about cannabis policy. What do I mean by that? President Trump has ordered the U.S. military to target major foreign drug cartels, specifically groups like Mexico's Sinaloa cartel and Venezuela's Tren de Aragua, and explicitly designate them as terrorist organizations. Now, this is a shift away from law enforcement-led operations towards a militarized response. On the surface, that's a national security story, but stick with me, because the indirect implications for cannabis reform may be more powerful than they initially appear. This narrative could reshape how legal cannabis is framed, how reform gains momentum, and how the policy environment evolves, especially around banking, rescheduling, and political framing. So let's walk through this step by step, all as a single continuous story that you could read straight. So let's begin with the shift itself. When the president orders the military to target cartels designated as terrorist groups, two things happen. Enforcement escalates and the language around drug policy changes significantly. Cartels go from being criminal enterprises to terrorist threats. That changes the public frame, and that frame, quite honestly, matters most. Now take a breath and consider how this reframing plays into the cannabis debate. Here's the contrast on one side. You have violent transnational cartels operating outside any regulation. And on the other, you have state legal cannabis markets built on transparency, oversight, and most importantly, public safety. This juxtaposition creates a clear narrative. Regulated cannabis markets are centers of stability, not chaos. This isn't hyperbole. Political messaging matters. Lawmakers respond to stories that resonate with voters' values around safety and legality. If cartels are terrorists abroad, then legal cannabis here at home becomes part of the solution, not part of the problem. That narrative shift may gradually soften resistance in Congress, in federal agencies, and in the public imagination. Now look, I'm not saying the U.S. will suddenly legalize cannabis next week because of this, but what does begin to shift is the policy ecosystem around reform. Enforcement against cartels becomes a justification for promoting regulated alternatives domestically. That's subtle, but it's also potent. And here's where things start to align with other reform levers. The executive order we recently covered, the one targeting debanking and directing regulators to strip out reputational risk as a reason to cut off lawful businesses, starts to make more sense. That order addressed banking access for lawful businesses. Its impact was limited, but it also was symbolic. Now layer on support for regulated alternatives to cartel violence, and that previously symbolic order feels more contextual and more inevitable. So let's be methodical here. First, cartel violence is reframed as a terrorist threat. Second, regulated cannabis stands in contrast: safer, licensed, accountable. Third, reform becomes a public safety narrative. And fourth, executives and regulators may find it easier to justify removing stigmatized barriers like reputational risk. That acts as a tributary to larger reform flows, including rescheduling, statutory banking protections like safer banking. To quote multiple perspectives, though the president's order is not about cannabis, advocates can use it to say, look, we have a state-regulated, cash flow taxed, audited industry right here, offering a safer alternative to violent illicit trade. That argument could drive more mainstream support for reform measures, including rescheduling. So with that, let's explore that a little bit further. Take rescheduling, shifting from cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. That changes the tax code, especially 280E, improves operator cash flow, and signals a regulatory softening. If lawmakers are already talking about combating violent cartels as terrorism, it becomes harder to justify denying medical or regulated cannabis the same recognition on moral or risk grounds. So that's not decisive, but it builds momentum. Then consider safer banking, federal protection for banks servicing state legal cannabis. Its message becomes more palatable when lawmakers are seeking alternatives to criminal networks. Banks can be framed not just as financial entities, but as partners in public safety. And here's also a critical point. None of this is automatic. The policy path as we know it remains choppy. Executive orders can be reversed, statutes like SAFER still require passage, and rescheduling is still complicated by FDA, DOJ, and international treaty considerations. But these pieces now interlink more coherently when framed in one narrative. So let's envision a political timeline of perception and policy effects, anchored around this military action. Phase 1, immediate narrative shift. The messaging around cartels as terrorists hits the media cycle. Cannabis advocates deploy contrast framing, regulated markets versus illicit violence. The conversation shifts towards legality as a virtue, not a vice. Then that brings us to Phase 2, regulatory tone change. Agencies like FinCEN and Treasury, already nudged by the debanking executive order, they find it easier to update guidance to treat cannabis more as a regulated economic sector rather than an ideological risk. Then there's Phase 3, legislative leverage. Lawmakers introducing or co-sponsoring safer banking can cite public safety framing to strengthen support. Rescheduling advocates use the narrative to soften the policy divide. Now we move to Phase 4, which is market and investor response. Markets react to shifting narratives. Companies emphasize compliance, transparency, cash controls. And investors, they respond to improved margins, lower risk, and potential federal future. But let's not minimize these risks. There are plenty. Military escalation doesn't guarantee policy reform. The public safety frame could just as easily be used to tighten enforcement against all drugs. Legislative priorities could drift without strategic coordination, and political opposition may deploy fear-based narratives, meaning, quote, any shift on cannabis equals more drugs on the street to halt momentum. That's why compliance, story discipline, and strategic narrative framing matter now more than ever. Operators and advocates must be ready with messaging that ties regulated cannabis directly to public safety goals. That is so important. Policymakers need clear evidence of compliance, tax receipts, and community benefit to justify continued momentum. So here's the distilled takeaway. President Trump's directive to have the U.S. military target foreign drug cartels as terrorist threats isn't directly about cannabis, but it reframes the battleground. Suddenly, regulated cannabis markets look like structured, accountable alternatives to violent, unregulated networks. That narrative opens the subtle doors for banking, for rescheduling, and really for broader reform. When you layer in the recent executive order or fair banking and the potential to reintroduction of safer banking, you begin to see a policy ecosystem taking shape, one where the cannabis industry could transition from the margins to the mainstream acceptance. But as we know, progress is not guaranteed. This momentum requires strategic navigation, messaging discipline, preparedness, compliance, and political coordination. So what are my final thoughts for operators and advocates? Double down on your compliance infrastructure now. Document why your operation supplies public goods, tax revenue, job creation, and reduced illicit activity. Prepare narrative talking points that frame cannabis as part of a community stability, not a risk. And for investors, watch the evolving narrative. If regulated cannabis becomes a public safety ally, regulatory risks drop, and margins look different when 280E fades and banking opens up. For policy watchers and reformers, this is an unusual moment when enforcement escalation may ironically fuel reform potentially. But with that, stay nimble and stay coordinated. So that's a wrap for today's Cannabis in 5. Lots to take in here, but it's an interesting angle on what this potentially could mean, not only for the war on drugs, but really how cannabis could be viewed for the regulated market moving forward. Let us know your thoughts. What did you think of the feedback we provided here today? Did you like this breakdown? If so, make sure to give it a like, smash on that bell for all notifications, and if you haven't done so already, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We'd appreciate it here at TDR. Like I said, that's it for today. Until next time, I'll see you in the next Cannabis in 5. I'm your host, Shad Dales. Enjoy your day, everyone.